Do you have the headphones?
Got them.
Cool. Here are those extra batteries.
Thanks. You guys ready to go?
Let's do it.
Shoot. The camera.
How did we get here? The same way we got from inside the house to outside in the previous scene, through a cut between two shots of film. But something was weird about this last cut. The jump from outside to this studio contradicts the space you were imagining the film taking place in. There's a key insight there that often goes unnoticed by film audiences. In addition to following the story that continues across a cut, we're also trying to understand the spaces that the story takes place in. This video is about the idea of spatial coherence in film, how our minds connect multiple disjointed shots into one coherent location in our imaginations. To start, let's discuss how we understand spaces in real life. Numerous experiments have shown that spatial perception is one of the easiest tasks for our brains to perform. People often remember objects' locations in a space without being told to, even when distracted by a conversation. We navigate a room by focusing on how the essential objects relate to each other and building a sort of simplified map in our minds. As we move through this room, we know our relative location to the door even though we can no longer see it. As long as we can see one prominent landmark, we're able to recall our relative location to every other object that we've stored in our mental map. In real life, when we enter a space, we're free to look around and take in as much information as we wish. When we watch a movie, however, our view is limited to the viewpoints the director gives us. When a scene begins, we store whatever obvious landmarks we see in the first shot into our mental maps, and use these as anchor points to ground the objects we see in subsequent shots. This is a process called incremental interpretation. Consider this sequence. While the second shot alone tells us only how the guitar and the person relate, we build on our prior knowledge of the space to determine the relative location of the chair to the person. There are two main ways to film a spatially coherent scene. The first is through analytical editing. We begin with a wide shot of the whole region in which the scene will take place. Each subsequent shot focuses in on one of the elements that we saw in the wide shot. Our unconscious minds can effortlessly map the spatial relationship of two close-ups since we've already seen their subject's relationship in the wide shot. The other way to film a spatially coherent scene is through constructive editing, which builds a scene piece by piece from non-overlapping shots. But without overlapping landmarks, how can we map spatial relationships? Viewers fill in the gaps between shots of film all the time, without even thinking about it. Here's a sequence from the book Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud.
Now you die!
No! You didn't see the shovel hit the victim, and you have no way of knowing for sure whose scream that was. Even so, we can't help but fill in the missing information. This is the true magic of film. Not the visual content of a shot, but the implicit connections our minds find between shots. Editing is what truly distinguishes film from simple animated photography and makes it a language. Montage, or placing independent ideas in a sequence, is what makes all of storytelling possible. Consider the story, "I was late for work, my car broke down." Neither of those sentences alone tells you that the breakdown was what caused me to be late. But when you put them next to each other, the whole of the story contains more information than the sum of its parts. The order of these two sentences implies the conjunction because. Similarly, placing two disjointed shots of film in the right order can imply a spatial conjunction between them. For example, think about the cut from inside to outside in the opening sequence. Neither of these shots alone tell you anything about the world on the other side of the door, but When placed next to each other, we recognize that the two pieces show a single coherent space. This is an example of a constructive inside-to-outside sequence. Moving forward, we'll examine different varieties of constructive sequences that each communicate unique spatial relationships between their shots. I'm cooking up a constructive scene called an aspect-to-aspect sequence. I'm not trying to communicate the exact angles or distances at which these shots relate, just that they're contained within a unified space. The only thing necessary to communicate this vague spatial information is associative cues: light, sound, and story. If we remove the associative cues, we no longer think of this montage as a single coherent space. Through consistent lighting, audio, and themes, I'm able to convince you that the shots share a common locale, even though, in real life, they don't. The power of constructive editing is that it allows a filmmaker to stitch together shots from entirely different real-world spaces into one purely cinematic space, not beholden to real-world constraints. Associative cues imply a unified space, and they alone do the heavy lifting for our comprehension of aspect-to-aspect and inside-to-outside sequences. In order to communicate more precise spatial layouts, filmmakers have a more powerful type of conjunction at their disposal: viewpoint constraints. Viewpoint refers to the camera's location relative to the content of a shot. Just as we can tell our distance from an object by looking at it in real life, when we see the content of a shot, we unconsciously extract the camera's relation to it. It's technically possible for filmmakers to move the camera anywhere between two shots. But in constructive sequences where specific spatial relationships matter, filmmakers have to limit their viewpoint changes to communicate spatial information to the audience. This sequence is conjoined by a point of view constraint. The first shot ends with a character looking down with a confused facial expression. The second shot shows us something confusing from an angle that mimics their eye line. These cues lead us to assume that we're looking through the character's eyes in the second shot. Not only do the associative cues tell us these shots exist within the same general locale, but we now know the exact angle at which the second shot connects to the first. Point of view sequences are so familiar to us that we take the shot's implied connection for granted. And, through the magic of constructive editing, we're tricked into picturing a spatial relationship that doesn't exist in real life. Camera motion can also help to imply a POV constraint. If we follow a shot of a character moving their eyeline by a shot moving in a similar direction or style, we assume that we're looking through the character's eyes. While POV constraints imply a clear spatial relationship, they create a particular stylistic feel that directors might not want to use too frequently. Luckily, there's a nearly invisible alternative that's so effective we see it in almost every mainstream scene.
Hey, dude.
Now, where is the blue character standing in relation to the red character? First of all, regardless of viewpoint constraints, our real-world knowledge tells us that they're probably facing the character they're greeting. But, thanks to the X constraint, we unconsciously assume a lot more than this. The red character was looking to camera left. The blue character was also looking camera left. The X constraint tells us that a scene must be shot in such a way that if we zoomed out from the second shot, both characters would still be looking camera left. When we enter any scene, we unconsciously identify an action line, either along the eye line of the first character we meet or down the path an object is traveling. The point of view constraint tells us that the second shot is filmed down the center of the action line in the direction the character is looking. The X constraint, however, tells us that the second shot was filmed so that the action line is pointed in the same left or right direction as it was in the previous shot. The X constraint is often referred to as the 180-degree rule by filmmakers, because this effect can only be achieved by shooting the blue character from the same side of the action line as the first shot. Within the X constraint, directors can apply more fine-grained conventions to give us additional specifics about the relationship between shots. In my example sequence, you may have found this interpretation to be stronger than the other two correct ones. That's because it's additionally consistent with the T constraint, which says that two shots with identical action lines will be filmed without rotating the camera at all. The T constraint can also be signaled by a shot with a clear action line, followed by a shot without any discernible action line. The R constraint says that two shots with mirrored eye lines pointed toward the camera will be filmed from the same angular distance from the action line. The second shot is a reflection of the first. This tells us that two characters are facing each other directly. Viewers understand that filmmaking is a form of communication. The director has a space in mind that they want the audience to picture. In the absence of geographic clues in a constructive sequence, viewers unconsciously assume that a filmmaker is using some form of the X constraint to give them information about the layout of the scene. If I filmed the blue character in my example sequence outside of the 180-degree arc that would maintain a constant direction of the action line, viewers would still assume I was following the X constraint, and picture the wrong spatial relationship between the characters.
Hey, dude.
This next shot jarringly disagrees with the space you were simulating. Let's take a quick existential detour. Why do we expect the X constraint to hold in the absence of other clues? And how do we know that the first sequence followed the POV constraint? The easy answer is that these viewpoint constraints roughly mimic our real-world experiences. We're used to seeing a scene from one direction, so we expect the action line to stay consistent. And we know that we can follow someone's gaze to what they're looking at. But the full answer has more to do with film's similarity to verbal language than to perceptual reality. While filmmakers might have originally invented these viewpoint constraints because of their similarities to the real world, it's our past experience with movies which have trained us to expect them. Experiments have found that first-time film viewers have trouble identifying spatial relationships in X constraint or R constraint scenes without dialogue. Furthermore, first-time viewers often perceive an object to have rotated between shots, where experienced viewers recognize that it's the camera which has changed positions. Those of us fluent in film language interpret this sequence as someone walking forward in a constant direction, thanks to the X constraint. But it would make just as much real-world sense to picture this person changing direction between shots. Additionally, while we all assume that the second shot in this sequence is from the character's point of view, it could just as easily be taken from the same position as the camera in the first shot, as we would see it in real life by turning our head. We are unconsciously fluent in the language of film. There might be other ways to communicate things than the system of viewpoint constraints that we've learned to recognize. But, as with verbal language, communication is aided when filmmakers use conventions that viewers are already familiar with. Theorists are currently working to identify more spatial conjunctions beyond the ones listed in this video. But they won't find new conventions, just ones we're already so familiar with, we don't obviously notice them. New, never-before-used constraints will arise the same way any new convention is introduced into language, through frequent, repeated use with clear context clues by many authors. But back to viewpoint constraints. When I was taught the X constraint as the 180-degree rule of filmmaking, I understood that a scene should only be filmed from one side of a space. This isn't the complete truth. A constraint doesn't hold across an entire scene, but rather just between two shots. we can use the X constraint between every shot of a scene while traveling 360 degrees around the space, as long as we allow the characters we focus on to shift their gaze, and therefore move the action line throughout a shot. This is often how triangular table scenes are filmed. But moreover, all of these conventions can be used to connect different shots within the same scene. With that in mind, let's return to the opening sequence of this video. All of these constraints worked silently to anchor you to a coherent space. I even broke the 180-degree rule. But, thanks to the process of incremental interpretation, hopefully you had enough information in your mental map to still feel grounded in the space. Until, of course, a character entered into a room that directly contradicted our spatial simulation. Many filmmakers strive for invisible editing. The spatial connections are so clear that you don't even notice the cuts. An old rule of storytelling says show, don't tell the action of a scene. But really, there's a third option. Filmmakers can use viewers' expectations of the language of film to encourage their audiences to complete elements of a story in space within their own minds. In the end, it's the audience that brings the film to life, within their own imaginations.